Welcome back to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for staying with us. Well, if you've tried virtual reality, either with a headset at home or at a local business, you know it can be very impressive and pretty fun. But for a surprisingly large portion of the population, VR is also really nauseating. And that puts a little bit of a damper on the potential uses of VR unless there's a fix for it. Well, Paul McNeilage, a neuroscientist with the University of Nevada, is here to talk about that. Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Now, this is really interesting stuff. VR has a lot of really fascinating applications, not just video games, right?
That's true, yeah. So right now we're seeing a lot of use of VR for entertainment. But there are a lot of other applications. Training, it's been used actually for decades already for training. If you think of driving simulators, flight simulators, that's a form of virtual reality. Therapy is another area where you can, for example, people who have phobias, they can be safely exposed to environments or triggers that in a controlled manner so that, you know, it doesn't get out of hand. People can kind of safely deal with it. Another kind of very nice application actually is kind of augmentation. So if you think of people who have certain disabilities and can't have experiences that the rest of us can have, VR can actually help them have those experiences. There's a really nice example of a student at UNR. He's in a wheelchair, but he always wanted to attend Burning Man. And some members of the library staff there actually went to Burning Man for him and recorded their experiences with 360 video. And he was able to actually experience Burning Man. Another thing they did is actually take a video camera on a ski slope. And so he was able to kind of virtually ski. And he hadn't skied since he was 12 years old. And he was able to have the experience of skiing again. So that's just one example, you know. Another example, maybe more practical, would be you can think of a mechanic, you know, looking under the hood of a car. With augmented reality, you can, for example, overlay part names and numbers on different parts.
Wow.
And so that's just one example. So all kinds of practical contexts where you could use this technology.
Oh, that's very cool.
So,
I didn't even think about that last one.
Yeah. So what we're seeing is really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of excitement around it, and all the major tech companies, Google and Apple and Facebook, are kind of investing heavily in VR and AR technologies. And one reason is because it's kind of the next iteration of interactive technology, if you want, right? There's kind of a trend towards increasing interactivity, right? You can think of the mouse as one step beyond the keyboard, and then you can think of a touch screen as kind of enabling that extra step of interactivity. And now with virtual and augmented reality, we're tracking head movements and hand movements and making that interaction with technology just that much more kind of fluid and natural and seamless. And so I think that's why there's this kind of excitement around it.
Yeah.
And right now it's just video games, but there's a future.
Right. It's really interesting too, because I think it's one step further, as you said, from like watching a movie, because it's immersive.
Yeah.
So you do a lot of work, obviously, in psychology and neuroscience. The way that brain reacts to being immersed in a VR environment, is it similar to the way the brain reacts to being in a real situation, or is it more comparable to like watching a movie, for example?
So that's kind of the holy grail for VR, is to come as close as possible to real reality, right? To make it feel like you're interacting in a very natural way in the natural environment. And right now we're a long way from that. But what the technology is doing to try to get there is really looking at how do we interact with our environment normally, and that's kind of the input, right? What motor actions do we generate, and what are the sensory consequences of those motor actions? And so the classic example, the reason we're seeing this surge in virtual reality now is because of what are called head-mounted displays, right? This is a screen that you put on the head, and the key innovation there is really just tracking the head movement and rendering the visual scene based on the head movement. So it's interactivity, right? It's using the head movement to control the visual scene, and that's yeah, that's to the extent that we can replicate those kind of motor sensory contingencies that we have in real reality, to the extent that we can replicate those in virtual reality, the experiences are going to get better and better.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting stuff. But I know that there is a little bit of a limitation, and that is in some scenarios, people get really sick, kind of like car sickness or motion sickness. It happens with the VR headset. I personally have experienced this. You know, just quickly, because obviously we don't have a lot of time, why is that happening?
That's happening because, well, the kind of leading theory, there are a couple different theories, but the leading theory is that just the way you get sick riding in a car, right? If you're not looking out the window, you've got a conflict. You've got a conflict between the visual stimulus to your movement through the world, which we call optic flow. That's this kind of full field pattern of motion. You can think about the jump to light speed in Star Wars or Star Trek, fast motion on the outside, slow motion in the middle. The brain is tuned to that and uses that to know how the head is moving in space. Okay, and so when you navigate through a virtual environment with the joystick, you're getting that visual movement, but you're not physically moving, right? So one key sense that's important for understanding motion sickness is actually the vestibular system. This is the sense of balance in the inner ear, and that's what a lot of my research focuses on, actually. And so it's that conflict between the visual cue to self-motion and the vestibular cues to self-motion that actually causes motion sickness, but also the kind of the technological version of motion sickness, which is VR sickness or simulator sickness,
and
cyber sickness.
And I think I read this in some of your research, because of women in particular have a different biological structure. The inner ear is smaller. They are affected more strongly by this?
So it does seem to be that there are more reports of VR sickness or cyber sickness in women than in men, kind of higher prevalence. And there's a lot of research that's focused on figuring out why that is. Why is there this difference between kind of susceptibility to simulator sickness in men versus women? And part of that is just understanding why the sickness is happening in the first place. And so the jury's still out. We don't really know why that's happening, but we're working on it.
Yeah, a lot of really interesting research. We have just a couple minutes left. What other things do you think could be coming out of this lab that you guys have at UNR?
Well, one exciting project we're working on is we're developing a headset to allow for virtual reality underwater. The reason we're doing this, it's actually a project that's funded by NASA. NASA trains astronauts for zero gravity in a big pool in Johnson Space Center where they can sink replicas of the space station or whatnot. But that's quite expensive to maintain this huge facility. And we thought, okay, well, VR, if you could get VR to work underwater, you could actually simulate floating in zero gravity, and maybe this could be a tool that's useful for NASA. So that's one thing that we're working on.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, yeah. Really, really cool. And then I understand that people can go try this out at the university if they're interested. They haven't tried out VR.
Yeah, I'd like to make the underwater VR available to everyone. We're not there yet, but there is in the Knowledge Center at UNR. There's a facility called At Reality, where there are, I think, 6 maybe different setups that you can go and try out. Some with bikes, some where you can row a boat, all different kinds of experiences that you can load up. You can do the virtual tour of Burning Man, things like that. And I believe that's open to the public.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah. All right, a minute left. Anything else that you'd like the public to know?
Well, I'd encourage them to come and try the technology, either at UNR or actually any smartphone can be used, through Google Cardboard or Gear VR. No, I think that's about it.
Yeah, I've seen those things. Yeah. You can buy them, stick your phone in it, put it on your head,
right.
and you get. It's not quite as sophisticated as the big ones, but still pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I sure appreciate it. Interesting stuff. Yeah. All right, well, that is it for this episode of Face the State. But for more information on all of this or to see past episodes, you can just head to our website. That's ktvm.com. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you next week.